Hello everyone and welcome back to my studio. I thought I'd show you the highlights of an orchid drawing that I created this week. I've never really felt that really fast time-lapse videos are very helpful because you can't see things close up, and in my opinion I always want to see a little bit more of what's going on with a drawing, like the strokes on the paper. But for this short YouTube video I can't show you the whole orchid drawing from start to finish in real time because it took over 3 hours to complete. So this way I can show you how I created parts of it while it speeds up a little, and I want to talk you through some of the key pointers that might be helpful if you're interested in drawing flowers and using pastel pencils. I'm using anthracite coloured Pastelmat for a surface with a couple of brands of pastel pencils for this tutorial. I created mostly back and forth strokes as I wanted to achieve gradual transitions using only a few colours. There are other colours in the orchid drawing other than these two colours I'm using here, but these top petals are predominantly white and lilac, which I've used as a base. I wanted to achieve smooth transitions with no stop and start lines that were visible, and to do this I used a very light as well as even pressure so that I didn't fill the tooth of the paper too much. This way I can apply several layers as well as add pigment with different colours later to refine those petals. Subtleties are all important when drawing flowers. On these petals I'm holding the pencil far back from the tip, as that way I can ensure a really light pressure. And I also added a bit of green there. When we first see flowers we might just see a pink flower, but there's so much more to it, and one of the reasons I love to draw is that I'm able to see and explore so much of what makes up its form, structure and colour. These are Conte a Paris pencils. You can see it's a wider diameter pencil than the one I've used before. I used predominantly a lilac colour and a burgundy for the main vibrancy of the petals. Essentially these are just lighter and darker values which establish surface depth in the petals. To create the outlines I traced them using white transfer paper. It would have been really tricky and time consuming to freehand the complexity of all the petals, and as it was I occasionally almost got lost in some of the petal formations and had to watch where I was placing down colour. I wanted the look of a botanical illustration, but since the majority of the petals have such light colours, I knew they wouldn't stand out on a white background, so I chose the anthracite colour, which is like a dark charcoal. It's really great working with darker coloured papers with pastel pencils as they really show up well. They're just really luminous and vibrant. Unlike soft pastels, which are also a wonderful medium, there's little dust, so therefore very little mess. But notice how I'm shielding my hand with some glassine paper as I work to avoid smudging the pigment everywhere. So if you're the kind of person that doesn't like a lot of cleanup after an art project, this is another great reason to explore pastels. I'm using a white pencil now to establish some of the edges. This first flower is made up of some rich pinks, reds and burgundies. Dark and light colours both show up really well. I'm careful as I work around the outside edge to include all of the curving edges of the flower. Pastelmat doesn't really allow pigment to move. I guess the whole idea is that it grabs hold of pigment, so the blending is done in the layering. Fingers can soften a little and push pigment into the tooth, but it's not the ideal way to merge colours, and I find that pencil stumps are only so effective on Pastelmat. All I did to create smooth transitions and blends was to use light layers, barely skimming the surface of the page and building up the pigment until I achieved the desired result. I'm adding some rich yellow now to the flower. One of the reasons that I don't sharpen my pencils this sharp is that this pencil is actually broken, so I'm really careful which side I use because I don't want it to snap. If I press down hard, which I don't need to, it's just going to snap right off. That's why I'm careful about how I sharpen pencils, and I use a General's manual sharpener, and I don't really need sharp points to create a detailed drawing. Pastels are powdered pigments in a stick form held together with a binder, usually gum arabic. But they're not like chalk, and pastels last forever. They literally do. They were first used in the 17th century, produced in stick forms known as soft pastels in Renaissance Italy. Unlike oils that have a tendency to fade and yellow with age, pastels are less susceptible to damage by light. For longevity, a pastel drawing is best kept under glass, and it will really stand the test of time. Pastel pencils are quick and fun as well as forgiving, and they're a lot faster than other mediums. But you can still achieve a lot of detail in them, so they're great for animal drawings, hair, feathers, little markings on flowers, and I've had my set of 60 Stabilo Carbothellos for about a year and a half, and I've used them extensively for a lot of animal and botanical studies, both large and small. They can be replaced open stock, meaning separately instead of buying a whole new set, and you can interchange brands easily as I'm doing here. But they're not to be confused with oil pastels, which are a completely different medium. And notice how I can layer over the white just here to knock down some of the brightness. You can just go back and forth with lots of colours, as the Pastelmat surface allows for such a lot of layering. I suppose one of the most unique features of pastels is their ability to place light colours over dark, which is nearly impossible with almost all other mediums, especially if you're used to working with coloured pencils, also a fabulous medium, but not near quite as opaque. Pastels allow you to work through your mistakes, and what I mean by that is if you don't like how your drawing is going, or you create a mark somewhere and you don't like it, maybe it's in the wrong place, you don't have to worry about it because you can just place another mark right on top, regardless of whether you've just put a dark colour down. I put a lot of white on top of my purples and burgundies in this drawing. This is also possible because of the surface that I'm using. Pastelmat is thick and really sturdy. It's a bit difficult to describe its surface, but here's a typical sanded art paper for pastels, and if you look closely you can see that it's a little bit different from the light grey Pastelmat. It's smoother. It comes in 8 different shades. I tend to use the large sheets, which I cut down to size, but you can also buy them in pads. Fairly smooth to the touch with just a small amount of fine grit, it's quite different to typical artist sandpapers that are used for pastels, and it does take some time to get used to. You can use the surface with soft pastels, hard pastels, pan pastels and pastel sticks, as well as pastel pencils. Whoa, that's a lot of P's, which is of course what I'm using here. It's also becoming increasingly popular with coloured pencil artists as well, because it has enough tooth, and that's the little peaks and valleys in paper, to hold pigment. Artists like the smooth transitions you can achieve, but it just takes a little practice to get used to the actual surface, and it's been described as velvety to the touch, but I'd say it's more like a cross between velour and a fine sandpaper. It also happens to be really expensive, but it's acid-free, archival, light-fast and water-resistant, so you can add water to it or odourless mineral spirits for more painterly effects. Pastelmat needs to be stored flat, so you can't bend it or fold it. The manufacturing quality is amazing. Sometimes with pastel papers there are some spots that are a little bit bald for some reason, but this rarely happens with Pastelmat. I've had some issues with it not being packaged correctly a couple of times because of incorrect shipping from art stores online, but not with the actual manufacturing of the product. I think that if you've never tried it before, that once you get used to it, you'll really like it, and honestly there's nothing that comes close to it on the market at the moment. For the second flower, I wanted to show you a couple of techniques. Notice how far away my fingers are from the tip of the pencil. This immediately allows me to create a lighter pressure, which can be difficult when you're first starting out. And when I say light pressure, I mean barely touching the page, just grazing it. And notice how my fingers are gradually getting closer where I want to add the outside edges of the flower when I need more control. This pencil that I'm using is a little bit different. It's by a company called The Generals and is actually a charcoal pencil. It's a charcoal 558 and it's the best for placing over pastel work because it's so opaque. It's the whitest and brightest white I've ever come across, so it's wonderful for fine lines, and I use it for edges, highlights in eyes, whiskers, hair, and anywhere where I want a pop of brightness otherwise hard to achieve with a white pastel pencil. Another trick that I use is that I don't sharpen my pencils all the time. There's a lot of unnecessary waste, and you can achieve a nice edge if you just turn the pencil with your fingers until you find the sharpest point. Sometimes I use pencil extenders when pencils get so small they're a bit difficult to hold, so these just bring the pencils back to a decent sized length. And I'm just going to speed up the rest of this drawing until I get to the very end to give you a final tip. I'm often asked if I use fixative. I don't usually, but if I'm taking it in and out of my portfolio, I use Spectrafix, which is non-toxic. The spray isn't fine enough on it though, and it can drip, so I transfer the liquid into a spray bottle used by hairstylists, and I spray it really lightly over the top. It gives a much finer mist, and then I can store it and it won't come off in my fingers or rub off when I move my artwork around. I sprayed this one and it's not hardly at all darker than before. Please subscribe if you like this and give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video.